Minister Charles Loring Brace founded the Children's Aid Society in the 1830s, although the earliest documentation of youth being cared for in foster homes can be found in the Old Testament and in the Talmud. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan announced a presidential proclamation that would make May National Foster Care Month. Every year, thousands of children in the United States enter into the foster care system due to abuse, abandonment, or neglect.
The primary goal of foster care are to provide a safe and stable environment for the youth, reunite children with their families when it's safe and feasible, prepare youth for adulthood, and to promote positive outcomes in terms of education, health, and well-being. Today, we are going to talk about the foster care system and what we can do to help. I'm Jessie.
I'm Chesh.
The Jericho.
And I'm Laura, and this is Reconfiguring Reality. All right, so today foster care is a topic, and we have a guest speaker, Krista, who worked with children and youth services for how many years?
8 years.
8 years. That's a long time.
It is a long time. And it's like kind of like dog years. So like in normal work years, that's like 20 years.
Why is it like doggy?
Because of the stress, the vicarious trauma, it just is not an easy job.
Have you kept up with the industry after you left?
A little bit. I do still have friends that still work at the agency, so I still have, and being a therapist, I still have my finger on the pulse there a little bit, but it's different on the therapy side.
Is foster care still a way for unscrupulous people to make money from the government by over fostering and stealing from the youth instead of using the funds appropriately?
So one of the things about the foster care system is every county in every city in every state has different regulations for children, youth, and family services and how they do their job. And so in Allegheny County, which is where I live, we have moved to kinship care more than traditional foster care. We're trying to place kids with family or what they call fictive family, which is like family friends, rather than being in a traditional foster home through a foster care agency. So there are still people that are abusing the system. There always will be, but outcomes tend to be better for kids when they're placed with someone they know, like a family member or a friend of the family that is family. So you don't see it as much, but it happens everywhere. And there are still people that do it.
That kinship care or whatever it was that you called, it was kinship care, right?
Yes, kinship care.
Do those families, those family members or friends of the family, do they have to be vetted through the foster care system?
So yeah, we had to, whenever we would look at a family member, so we would go in and say we knew that we had to remove a child. We would ask mom and dad, who in the family do you think would be willing to foster your kid for you? And they sometimes would give us names, sometimes they would just be salty and not want to cooperate. So we would look into the family, we would do background checks, we would ask the family, are you willing? And there was a whole department that did this, that I didn't have to do it. But we would go out and vet the family pretty much. Are you willing to be a caregiver? This is what all it entails. This is what you'll have to do. Because there's a responsibility. There's a lot of responsibility to fostering a child. It's not just you let this kid come live with you, make sure that they go to school and go to the doctor, and that's fine. That's it. There's court, there's visits, there's therapy, there's a lot of responsibility. So, are you willing to do it? And if they say yes, then you have to go out and you assess their home. You do background checks on everyone that lives in the house who's over the age of 14. And then sometimes stuff will pop up on a background check, and then we have to go to court and ask the judge, like, is this something that we need to worry about because it's like a DUI from 20 years ago and they have nothing else? Or is this something that's going to preclude them from, being able to be a placement? So we still do all of the same checks that we would do if it was stranger care. But in the long run, it's still better for the kids because if they pass all those background checks and they get cleared, that's grandma or aunt or uncle or, whatever, cousin Billy that I've known since I was 2 years old and now I'm 12. So it provides a better outcome overall. But yeah, we still did all of the same checks we would do for a stranger placement. The biggest difference is when we're doing a stranger placement, those people have already been vetted by a foster care agency. So there's not it doesn't take as long. We can say, oh, this family's already been cleared. We can place this kid with them in like 10 minutes, where sometimes it takes like a day to find who, if this other family member is appropriate.
And in order to become a foster parent without being related to the child in question, there's a whole application process, is there not?
There's an application process. There's just like with family, there are home inspections, background checks, um, and a lot like in families can also, when it's stranger care, a family can say in their application, I only want to provide care to infants through age 3. Or for me personally, if I ever do follow up and decide to become a foster parent through the system, I only want to foster teenagers, because there's such a shortage of homes for them.
Mm-hmm.
So, there are a lot of different, that's a difference. Because if, say I was going to foster my nephew, it's not going to matter how old he is or whatever. He's my nephew. He's going to come live with me. But if I were going to take in a child that I don't know, then I have specifics. I don't want an infant. I don't want to start over. I want a teenager who needs the roof over their head and someone who's going to be patient with them and understand. So
I know if I would have stayed in Pittsburgh, I would have applied to become a foster parent for teens, but I'd also open the possibility of being an emergency foster parent. So in the middle of the night, they could call me up and just say, "Hey, we need you to foster this kid overnight."
Yeah, but isn't it a little messed up that people can cherry pick what type of child they want to when it's I only want an infant to 3 year olds, when statistically isn't it higher rates of children who are school age that are put in foster care systems?
So I don't know the statistics. I just know from my personal experience. So there are a lot of newborns that get placed because brother and sisters are already in placement. And if you have one kid in placement and you have a baby, that baby gets removed from you once it's born and gets put into placement. And then there's a hearing to determine if it would be appropriate for the baby to be returned to your care. Um, so there's definitely a need. There are a lot of infants. And I can see where, yeah, it is kind of messed up that you can be specific about that. But on the flip side of it, too, do you really want someone like me who I'm over the baby thing? I don't want a newborn being the caregiver to a newborn when really I'd rather have a teenager. I think it's more messed up that there are a lot of people that are like, oh no, I don't want teens or middle school age kids because they're hard. They act out and they misbehave. Well, yeah, they do. They've been through trauma. So,
I know.
in a
Well,
way.
in 2024, 41% of children in the foster care system were ages 5 to 12. Infants was 7%. 1 to 4, this age group has been the most common in foster care since 2011. Children 13 to 17 were 23%.
I wonder if the percentage of teens is lower because when they get removed, they go on run and they run away and they hide at their friends' houses and don't tell people where they are. So they aren't being counted as being in care because they're not in care. They're not in a foster home.
So
that happens a lot too.
We like to think ourselves as a pretty progressive country, right? With a lot of changes being made for the better and things. Foster care, however, has been something that's been pretty archaic. over the last 100 years or so, to the point that other countries, for example, Japan, children will lose all relatives and have no one to stay with and be expected to care for themselves and get a job and hold down an apartment, things like that. This is pretty regulatory. It's not to say that they're all that way, but that is just a cultural standard or norm that a lot of them have accepted. Same things with like China and things where a village might raise a person, but they don't necessarily have a dedicated family or foster system. Given the newer thoughts behind like pro-choice and abortion and things like that, you know, some countries have looked at even having like euthanasia for older children. The idea that if they don't have a place to go, it's more humane to give them a humane death than have them fall to the wayside, starve to death, be lost in the system, be taken advantage of, things like that. Where would you think we would sit on that? Do you think it's more or less progressive to treat them like either young adults or a commodity where, like you said, people tend to pick and choose. They want newborns or babies or whatnot, as opposed to their generosity being universal. Where do you think the level of care sits, and where do you think, you know, as a society, our morality, our vote in morality should lean towards being someone who's worked more closely and not just somebody who has a sort of pie in the sky, I want to adopt a baby kind of view?
So I can say from my experience as a caseworker and having worked with these kids, I ended up going back to school and getting my degree in therapy in counseling psychology because of the work I was doing with teens and transitional age youth, which is 16 to 25, um, and seeing how we are really failing that age demographic. Kids are aging out of the system with no life skills, nowhere to go. And particularly too, it gets even more specific because a lot of it is LGBTQ plus youth. Because these families, mom abandons them and says, get out when they come out, or teenagers are difficult. And so mom, and a lot of our kids that go into placement that are teens, they're in placement because they got kicked out. And then the family doesn't want to get involved. So then these kids, and nobody wants to foster teens. So they go into a group home. And then when they age out, they get kicked out of that group home and they've nowhere to go. And even if they stay involved in the system, which they can do until they're 21, we don't have places for them to live. They don't know how to get a job. They don't know how to maintain a job. Um, and there's a lot of behaviors tied to trauma that got them involved in the system in first, and then systemic trauma from being involved in the system, and then being kicked out of the system once they age out, and they just don't know how to function.
So
And our Go ahead.
why aren't the parents charged with abandonment then?
So if a parent calls CYF and says, I've had it, come get my kid,
That's still
CYF goes out
abandonment.
and investigates. Right, but I don't know. That's actually a good
Because
question.
that doesn't make any sense. Just because your child isn't the way you envisioned your child to be, that's still abandoning your child. You decided to have that child. You decided to sit there, and just because they're not the way you want them to be, you don't get the choice to abandon them. You are responsible for that child until the age of 18. And in some
Yeah,
states,
I
like
don't.
my state, my mom kicked me out 2 weeks before I was supposed to graduate. Legally, she wasn't supposed to do that because until I graduated from high school, she was still legally responsible for me.
Yeah, I don't know why parents don't get charged for like child endangerment and um
I can
but
answer that.
endangering the welfare of a child and abandonment. That's actually a really good question. I have no idea. That would be a better question for someone who has a legal background, maybe. Um, I just know that I can't even tell you how many times a parent would take their kid to the psych hospital, drop them off there. Kid would go through, a 3-day stint at the hospital. And then it'd be time for them to go home. And CYF would get the call from the hospital. We have a mom who's refusing to come pick up her kid. We need a caseworker to come out and get them and go out and do an investigation.
Oh,
Um, and it happens a lot because the parents just don't want to deal with their kid. And, my
And maybe
kid's
they should
difficult.
be euthanized or sterilized then. You chose to have that kid just because that kid, maybe you fucked him up and you just don't want to take the blame. Well, actions have consequences. You want to abandon your child, you can go sit in jail for a year or two.
So the answer to that question as to why they don't get prosecuted is the same reason that pro-choice exists. You can't force somebody to do something they don't want to do, is what the end of the day. Now you
But
could say you have legal
child
responsibilities.
abandonment is illegal. You're
You're
abandoning your
not
child.
abandoning them if you're relinquishing it to the government. That's the catch 22. Abandoning by definition means like if you just dropped them out of your car in the middle of the Ozark and drove off, that's abandonment. If you go to a body and say, I can't take care of them anymore, you need to take them. It then becomes the burden of the government's responsibility to take that over
But
because
there
you,
have been people who have dropped their kids off with family and friends and just never came back to get them, and they've gotten charged with abandonment.
What's that? What's that law that allows?
Safe haven, the
Yeah.
safe haven law. Yeah, you have to drop your child off at an approved drop off location, like an
So that's
emergency
how
room or a
that's how the
fire
hospital, that's how
station.
they get around it with the hospital, because the child was in.
Right.
right.
Or calling child welfare and saying, come get my kid.
But the other half of that coin you have to remember is, like I said, it's the same thing as like abortion. Why aren't they charged with murder? Right? If people start making an argument of consciousness or of growth and all, and you can argue semantics all day you want, but at the end of the day, why aren't you responsible for the life you helped create? Now, with the very rare exceptions of people like who had forced birth or insemination, things like that, most of the time people just don't want the responsibility. They're living their best life, and so they ditch it. So why are they held to a different standard than somebody who's getting rid of an older child?
Because if I'm 18 weeks pregnant, the likelihood of a child surviving and being able to thrive and not have all these different issues is totally different than abandoning a 13-year-old because they're gay.
Right, but
It's a just because your child, if you're Christian and you don't believe in being gay, that doesn't give you any right to abandon a child because it doesn't appease your religious viewpoints.
but it's the same argument though, is what I'm saying, right? Why did for us to parents they try to adopt and it doesn't work out and they take the kid back? Why aren't we throwing them in jail and say, nope, you signed the paperwork, you have to do it? It's because if they're not a good fit, then they promote more of a danger by leaving them with that. For that same reason, if you were a gay child and your parents were absolutely anti-gay, and to the point that they want to basically end your life, right? But they're not willing to murder you, but they're going to treat you like a third world citizen in your own house and make you feel ashamed or try to send you to like pray away camp or whatever. Is that more abusive than simply giving them a
It is,
foster
but
home?
children don't get taken out of homes like that sometimes too. Even if the child reports it to the CPS or say CY, it depends on where you live. Like me, it's CPS here.
Sure,
But
but then you have a different argument that standpoint, right? So then if you're arguing, well, that's abusive if they're sending them to pray away camp, why? What's the difference between someone saying, don't say something that's racist and you should believe in Jesus? It's a forced opinion on that person. And that's what I'm getting at is that it doesn't matter what you think is right. Your morality has nothing to do with the laws as they sit. Even though they talk about in courts, every court case you've ever seen, like in movies and stuff, they make some compelling, heartfelt argument. Everybody cheers and they act like it's happily ever after. In real life, when that happens, it goes to Supreme Court and gets overturned because the law is supposed to be emotionless. It's not supposed to care about your feelings. It's not supposed to protect people from hurt or bad things. It's the letter of the law. When people bring emotions into it, it creates loopholes for bad people to do bad things. And it's not just kids that we're talking about. I don't want to get into a giant tangent, but my point is to answer the original question, why are they allowed to get away with things? Is because once you've given the government the power and authority to make moral decisions for you and not take your peers or your culture or your society's viewpoint on something, we're not perfect and we make flaws, but the reason our governmental system works and has worked despite its flaws is because we go by the will of the people. And unfortunately, sometimes the minority could be in the right, but the majority is wrong. And that's the But if the majority says they're in the wrong, things fall through the crack. It's not a perfect system, but that's the system we live by. So I don't agree with it any more than you do. However, I also know that the reason they're going to get away with it is because, if you leave somebody in a bad home, it's going to be more detrimental than them losing their parents or whatnot. Now, for the
Yeah, and the
child,
foster
there's
care
going to be trauma
system drops the
regardless.
ball all the time. I was in foster care and I got put right back in with my abuser because the system was too overcrowded, and my mom had people sit there being able to say, "Oh, don't worry, we'll make sure it never happens again."
Right. And that does happen. And it still happens even today. But you have to remember, you're talking about even what we consider to be staggering numbers in America is dwarfed and infinitesimal to the rest of the world.
Yeah, but certain other countries have a system set up to be able to deal with children who may need financial help that are 16, 17, are able to sit there and still go to school, own an apartment, work a part-time job, but still get an education. They have a society that sits there and has programs to make
The,
sure that they're not thrown aside. Ours is you're 18 and you're pretty much kicked out. Good luck, have fun.
so that's true to a point, but you have to also remember that the countries that people like to point to with that are isolated, xenophobic biomes, right? So if you're in a Scandinavian country, for example, right, and your entire populace consists of about, say, 3 million people, it's really easy to take the funds of your country and then offer those aids to 3 million people. But when you are in the 300 million people mark, it's not so easy to do that. It's like why don't we give free education to all the people? Well, if you figure at 30 million people, say 30 million children a year, the multiple trillions of dollars it would take to fund everyone through college, where are you going to get that money? Would you like to have 80% of your check taken for taxes? Because how are you going to pay anything? That's the problem. All those countries that have this perfect utopian society that socialists love to point towards, they're a populace that doesn't even match one of our states. Big groups of people cause big problems.
Tax the people who make millions of dollars every year, higher percentages. Don't let them have loopholes. It's simple. It's just people don't want to fucking do it because the people who wind up in foster care and everything, they're ants to them. They're the grasshoppers and we're the ants.
Well, there's also, you know, a caveat to that as well. Yes, there are rich people who have a lot of money, but that under that ideal, someone could walk in your house and take your stuff and say, well, you don't need a computer and you don't need to be on the internet and you don't need to do
No,
this
because
because there's
I
poor
bought and
people.
paid for it with my money, and you can't walk into my home without my
But that's what you
approval.
just said. When you say pay more tax the rich, you're saying steal
I
the
pay
money that
more
they
out of
earn.
my paycheck than most millionaires do because there's loopholes and all this other kind of stuff. But to them, people in the foster care system, oh, your parents should have took better care of yourself, or your parents should have just gave you up, or your mom was a drug addict, so it's your help.
So just remember though that when you say more, you're thinking percentagely, you're not thinking amount. If I make $1 billion a year and I donate 100 million of it to charity, and on top of it I get charged, let's be really low ball it and say I get charged 5% of my billion. My 1 year's contribution is more than your entire lifetimes. You are the problem in that scenario, not the rich. Do you see what I'm saying?
Krista, I sent you a website. Do you know anything about that website? You ever
Let me
seen it
look at it.
before? And I have
Yeah.
another question for Krista as well.
Um, I have not ever seen this before, but I'm gonna look at it right now.
Okay, let me know if you think it's legit. Um, out of all of the cases that you served on, Krista, how many did you actually get to reunite the child with the family?
I'm thinking. Um, two?
In the 8 years that you worked there?
Right. But so a lot of them were still in placement and parents were still working through what they needed to work through when I left. I had two, three that went through adoption, and in two of those children, mom had passed away from a drug overdose.
Oh.
So I couldn't reunify. And then we had what is also called SPLC, which is subsidized permanent legal custody, which is the parents maintain their parental rights, but the foster parent becomes the legal guardian. So that down the road, if mom and or dad get it together and they want to regain custody of their child, they can go back through the court and do that. And I had a lot of those that got finalized. And a lot of those kids that were SPLC, they were in the care of grandma or aunt or cousin or family friend, whatever it was. So it was a lot easier to work through the system and do what needed to be done for them to eventually reunify. A lot of it was you have 2 years for the child to be in placement in foster care before you start the process for either terminating rights or doing legal guardianship. So, I was there for 8 years. Of the kids that got removed, most of them, they stayed in placement. And it's funny because we would only have 2 years, but I had some cases that were on my caseload for like 5-6 years because we'd be getting ready to make a move and change things and mom would have another baby. So that would keep the case open longer because then now like the clock starts over.
There's a website that says it's fosteruskids.org, and it's a great place to go and get information about foster parenting and the foster care system.
You can also go right to the county you live in, right on the county website, and they will have information on how to apply to be a foster parent. And it'll tell you what agencies are in your area to apply to and to reach out to.
Fantastic. Krista, thank you so much for joining us today.
You are very welcome.
That's going to be it for today's podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe. What?
Like, subscribe, follow, comment,
share.
And we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.
And remember, be like Angelina Jolie. You got to catch them all. Foster today.